the lawlessness and the senselessness of what's going on in the city of Baltimore. No accountability. And then to watch Baltimore Mayor Democrat Stephanie Rawlings Blake say we gave the rioters space to destroy. Really? So you have to ask yourself, did the mayor facilitate a riot by those comments saying, hey, if you want to destroy, we're going to give you space. In fact, here's some matches and a cup of gasoline. Why don't we give you a starter kit? I needed some perspective on this, so we called who I consider to be the best person to talk to about this, Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clarke, joining us this morning. Sheriff, good morning.
Morning, sir. Morning to your listeners.
And glad to have you here. You've gained some notoriety, to say the least, over the last few years and elevated yourself on the national stage because, well, quite simply, you don't fit the mold. You're a county sheriff. You've been there, I think, since 2002 in Milwaukee County, a big county in the state of Wisconsin, obviously. And you've faced many of the same challenges as other law enforcement, professional law enforcement people around the country. But you don't fit the mold because you're outspoken, you're black, and you speak out against these things, and you focus on some of the concerns of letting liberals run these cities. In fact, you're outspoken that liberalism going too far is behind these Baltimore riots. Let's start with the riots in Baltimore. How would you have addressed it in your position if something similar was happening in your city? Because I see that they laid back, they waited, the mayor waited, the governor waited. Finally, we have some National Guard troops moving in, but it seems like it took an awfully long time.
Too long, as a matter of fact, and we've seen this before, and it really chaps my rear end, so to speak, to watch the city officials. It's a failure of leadership, really, at the city level. Some of it extends to the command level of the police departments, not the officer on the street. They're just following orders. But I'm tired of seeing these police put in these losing positions. They're put out there to act as human shields. The strategy seems to be one of appeasement. The police officers are taking on casualties. You saw the pieces of concrete. These weren't rocks. These were pieces of concrete that were being hurled at them. To me, it justifies the use of deadly force, or at least some kind of higher level of force than what we saw yesterday. They're sitting ducks, and I don't know why we put these America's finest, Baltimore's finest, in harm's way without any real strategy, operational strategy to defend themselves. I mean, they took on, the last I heard, 15 officers injured. And my question was, how many injuries from the rioters and looters? And I haven't heard that number, but I don't think too many.
Law
enforcement goes out there and they have to be reasonable, but they can't be afraid to inflict casualties to defeat the spirit of these thugs and send a message that this isn't really going to be worth it.
To lay down the law, if you will, and say, listen, this has to stop. I don't know the specific facts of the death of Freddie Gray. We're all waiting on that. He obviously was in video, and he was injured badly when he was taken into police custody. He died a few days later. But we are a nation of laws, sir, and that's where I get confused, letting this lawless approach and the rioting in the streets and to stand back. And I think you're right. They're facilitating these riots and standing back. And how does it help anyone, the mayor or the governor or anyone, to let the city burn? How does that promote anybody's civil rights?
Well, it doesn't. The mayor's in over her head. I watched her pathetic news conference yesterday. She has no clue of what to do. But the fact that she and that police commissioner put Baltimore's finest out there to play patty cake with people who are hurling bricks and pieces of concrete at them, I think is pathetic. But when you talk about the rule of law, the rule of law must prevail. I don't know what happened in the guy who lost his life. I don't know what happened either. I don't know all the facts. I don't want to comment too much on that. But this is not a socially acceptable way to deal with the frustration. The frustration brought on by failed liberal government policies. If these people are angry, the residents of Baltimore, it's not all of them. It's just this sub-black culture of the underclass, a growing underclass, a permanent underclass, whose behaviors are on display. But if they're angry at anybody, it ought to be at their Democrat leaders, including the mayor, including the former governor, including Elijah Cummings, who I saw yesterday stand in the pulpit of a church, bumping his gums about we need structural change. Elijah Cummings has been a career politician. He's been in the Congress for 15 years, and before that he was in the Maryland House of Delegates, their legislature, for 14 years. And I would have to ask, Mr. Cummings, what structural change have you brought about in your position of leadership for almost 3 decades of service to the people of the Baltimore area? And the answer is zero.
That's exactly right.
When I talk about a failure of leadership, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Tuesday on the Steve Gruber Show, Sheriff David Clarke from Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, here sorting out the riots in Baltimore. And you're right about the progressive utopia, the projects, the war on poverty, the welfare state, big government here to help you every step of the way. But along the way, Sheriff, what I see is zero accountability.
None. And these individuals continue to be elected back into office. They're perpetrating the misery that many of the good law-abiding people who would like to see change in the Baltimore area but aren't seeing it under these failed liberal policies, which, as you indicated, created a welfare state which keeps people dependent. And the danger in keeping people dependent is that at some point you're not going to have anything to give out to them, and that's when they're going to unleash. This has nothing to do with the death of that individual in police custody. It had nothing to do with that. These thugs did not know that individual. They'd never met that individual. They weren't at the funeral of that individual. These same rioters in a Baltimore nightclub would just as soon have shot that individual themselves for bumping into them on the dance floor. That's the kind of underclass behavior we see, this black-on-black crime. Baltimore has the 5th highest murder rate in America, the 7th highest violent crime rate in America. 90% of the homicide victims last year were black, and 90% of the perpetrators of that homicide were black. So the black-on-black homicide and the black-on-black crime is a bigger problem and the thing that should be railed against by these individuals, not these isolated incidents involving the police.
Sheriff David Clarke, clearly that's common sense, and it seems that a lot of the common sense is sidestepped. We saw it in Ferguson. We've seen it in Baltimore. My fear is that the timing here is terrible. It's April. It's almost May. We're going into summer, and if the President of the United States doesn't step up sometime soon, this has the possibility of metastasizing across this country. We have about 20 seconds, sir. We need to go to a break. Can I hold you just for a minute longer?
Sure.
I'd like to talk to you just a minute longer. David Clarke here, the Milwaukee County Sheriff, and I want to talk about this possibility that these riots will leave Baltimore and end up in other cities, Cleveland, Detroit, L.A., who knows? If something isn't done, because so far, President Barack Obama remains silent on the issue. A bit disconcerting to say the least. Sheriff David Clarke, the Milwaukee County Sheriff since 2002, professional law enforcement, your career, sir. And as you look at what's going on with the riots in Baltimore, obviously a lot of things to consider here. Let me ask you about this. On the police department in Baltimore, I heard that 46% of the officers on duty, and it's a large department, some 3,000 officers, I think, sworn, 46% are black. So let me ask you, all of this is allegedly over race and police brutality and so forth. But when nearly half of your police force is black, what kind of extra pressure is on an officer in the field for Baltimore, on the front lines here?
Well, I don't think there's any extra pressure at all. And the reason I say that is because when these cop haters, these thugs, these criminals that we see in the streets of Baltimore right now, when they look at an officer, all they see is blue. All they see is the uniform. So I don't believe that there's any extra pressure. But I think it's important to point out that nearly 50% of that agency is black. We heard in Ferguson that the cause of those riots were that they had very few black officers. You have a black commissioner in the city of Baltimore. You have a black mayor. You have other black officials. And that's why I say this is beyond, this is above anything about race or anything about Freddie Gray, the individual who seemed to be at the center of the protests and the rioting that followed. And, it's really a situation of people who won't look in the mirror. A lot of the pathologies that affect the Baltimore area affect many urban areas throughout the United States, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Miami, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, Los Angeles. They're self-inflicted pathologies. School failure is one of them, drug and alcohol abuse, father-absent homes, kids out of wedlock, failure to raise your kids, ineffective parenting. And you look at those things when you don't grasp education as a way out of generational poverty. You only have yourself to blame, but that stuff is exacerbated by these failed liberal government policies.
Failures of leadership. Yeah, there's a failure of leadership.
Motivation and keep people dependent on the high of handouts.
Well, my concern, and I'm going to ask you your opinion, obviously, if this happened in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, I'm going to make the assumption that the reaction would be different and more law and more by the law. But my concern is for the lack of leadership. In New York, we ended up with 2 dead police officers in New York City. We had 15 officers injured so far. One of them severely was unresponsive as of last night, still waiting to hear his condition. But when you see rioters screaming, what do we want, dead cops? When do we want them now? My concern is that as we head into summer, if this isn't quelled and we have leadership from the White House, that this has the propensity to metastasize across this country. That has to be a concern for yourself in law enforcement and others in major law enforcement districts across this nation.
Sure it does. And I think we're in a cycle of this. You are going to see it more and more because many of the conditions exist in many urban areas throughout the United States. But, Steve, don't look for any leadership from the White House. I think with a wink and a nod, the president is silently enjoying what he's seeing because he stokes the flame of racial animosity. He needs division between people. He's been effective at gaining political power through keeping people divided, and you have to keep people angry to keep them divided. And that's why I said he's quietly enjoying this. And I will challenge anybody who thinks that that's over the top for me to say that. He's demonstrated that time and time again. He's one of the ones that led the rally and the cry of the Republicans are trying to take your vote away, the rich, the 1%, income inequality, all of these divisive issues that he continues to throw out there to stoke up animosity between the masses has been very destructive for America, but it's been politically advantageous for him.
Why do you think you're an anomaly? And I don't mean being a professional law enforcement individual, but I mean politically, your worldview being different. Barack Obama took more than 90% of the black vote in 2012. And it just seems to me that despite their overwhelming evidence and their best interest being served by voting some way differently than they have for decades and decades, the black community, by and large, votes for Democrats blindly, and yet you lay out such a perfect argument. You articulate it so well that, the welfare state, the dependence, the cycle of poverty and a permanent underclass, and yet they vote for it time and again. Why, sir? Well,
because they've been duped. They've been separated from their history. Government handouts are an intoxicating high, and they're used as a lure to keep black people chained to, this monolithic voting pattern of voting for Democrats with the promise of more free stuff, free handouts, but have an ability to see through the nonsense, see through the BS, and then communicate that in a way that people can understand. I have the support of black people in my community. I would have been elected to the office of sheriff 4 times, and I need the black vote to get that done. So the fact is that they appreciate that I have a very, very clear understanding of what's going on. These people are being exploited. My people, black people across America, are being exploited by the Democrats, and their families have been ripped apart by these welfare policies starting in the 60s with the so-called war on poverty. It has been destructive for the black family. The black man has been emasculated. He's been marginalized, removed from his rightful position in the family unit, and replaced by who? Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam is a horrible provider. Uncle Sam is a very poor father. Uncle Sam has no business raising kids. The black man needs to be restored back to his rightful place in the household, to begin to engage with his kids, raise his kids, instill virtues and values and discipline in his kids. And once we put the black family unit back together and we break down this thing for individuals to clearly see what's going on, they're being used.
No question.
And until they're reconnected with their history, of the Democratic Party and the lives of black people, including going back to the slave days, the Jim Crow days, all led by Democrats in the South. Then once we start to see more clearly and think for ourselves, I don't tell people who to vote for. I just give them information, and I trust that they'll make the right decision.
Sir, I have to leave it right there. What I appreciate most, sir, is your Midwest common sense. Sheriff Clarke, thank you so much.